Thank you very much, Sandy. Thank you for asking me to come to talk to you this evening. Do raise your hand if you can't hear me, and I'll just try and project a bit louder. Is that all right at the moment? Thank you. Well, as Sandy said, I grew up in Highams Park, and unlike my older sister, who now lives in Chicago, I've stayed quite local. In fact, I never got further than the top of Oak Hill, because now my husband and I have lived in Derby Road, up by the Napier Arms, for the last 24 years. And before that, we were living in Woodford. So we haven't really moved very far. I was born in 1953, and the only family home I've ever known from that era was my parents' house in Gordon Avenue. And there's a photograph of it here, you can see later. And my husband Martin, who's sitting at the back, he took this last summer, I think, with our two grandchildren who live in Suffolk. And you wouldn't really recognise the house anymore because we had quite a big front garden and lots of sort of overgrown bushes and trees, so much so that somebody once dumped a sort of mailbag in the front garden from some robbery or something, and it took ages before we saw it, and then the police came and took it away. But you know, the front garden was quite big in those days, and now it's all been paved over and the old garage is knocked down, and there's a lot more space there. And I do have a photo at home, and gosh, there's my father's old Morris 8 car up the drive, and it looks quite different. Well, that's close to Highams Park Lake, as you all know, and I went to Sydney Burnell Infant School, which was the only infant school in Highams Park in those days, and then on to Selwyn Junior Girls School, and there wasn't any other option, apart from perhaps Miss Muddins up the avenue, if you remember that.
Yes.
It's wonderful that I've kept in touch with two friends from that time, Karina Jarvis and Rosemary Marks, and we go right back to Sydney Burnell Infants, and it's lovely that we still see each other nowadays. I was the only girl in my class, aged 11, to go to Leytonstone High School for girls, which seemed a really long way away in those days. And subsequently then, a lot of my social life was based in that area. And then I went on to train to be a teacher at Christchurch College, Canterbury. I married in 1974 and had a teaching career in Walthamstow. And for the past 24 years, as I mentioned, we've lived in Derby Road. I don't actually come down to Highams Park often now, but I have very fond memories of the place, going back to the 1950s and 60s, such as the photographs you can have a look at later. And in fact, I can't imagine growing up in a nicer place. I really can't. Childhood seems to go on forever. In reality, it is only a few years. And so no wonder we look back and think places always stayed the same. Inevitably, places change, the world changes, and Highams Park has been no exception. But then Canterbury has changed a lot since I was there. And as a teenager, I had a Saturday job in Liberties in Regent Street. And Regent Street has changed massively. I was on a bus going past the other day, and I thought, where did that used to be, and where did that used to be? Because it's all changed completely. But for me, Highams Park has stood still in my memory. And that is what I would like to tell you about tonight. And before I do, I would just like to say that since I stopped full-time teaching, and I now work part-time from home, I've enjoyed writing. And I started with articles in magazines, and now I've published actually probably about 50 different books and booklets of poems and short stories and novellas. And writing has been my passion. I'd say it's been my hobby, really. And I would encourage anyone who wants to write to just do it and see where it takes you. And I'm sure lots of you are much better qualified to give this talk than I am, because you have all these memories, just like me. Well, years ago, I shared some memories with Krina, and that's how she passed those on to Sandy, and that's why I'm here tonight. So, I'm going to start. What I have come to the conclusion, thinking about this talk, is that our individual memories depend on which part of Highams Park we lived in. Because I lived near the lake, and my walk home from school was along the avenue, and I was often up at Woodford Green as well, because that was only a walk up to the Charter Road, and that was where we went to the doctors. And when I caught buses to school friends' houses in my teens, it was often from the castle. So those were my particular memories of the avenue going towards the lake. But similarly, both my sister's memories, one sister is 6 years older and my other sister is 9 years younger. Well, they have the same little patch, but of course, their memories differ because of the different times in which they were living, and yet we all grew up in the same house. So memories are always very subjective, and yours are bound to be different to mine. But let's see what you can remember of what I'd like to tell you. So, I could hardly liken Highams Park to blue remembered hills, a land of lost content, but the sentiments I feel for the East London suburb remain indelibly in my mind as inane housements. It was the place where I grew up. It represents security, order, a 1950s childhood. Walk there now, and so much has changed. Banks have become shops, mini-markets. There are blocks of flats where old houses once stood, with wrought iron verandas and imposing gateways. The motor car, in my thoughts, comparing it to perhaps this picture here, has made some of the place a little bit congested, too small to cope with the volume of traffic in the rush hour. But a glimpse of how things were can be seen in decorated tiles lingering in porches, door knockers or stained glass, fragments from another era, time past. So I tell it how it was from a child's perspective, rose-tinted, wistfully turning the clock back to a time when streets seemed wider and uncluttered. Everything to a child's eye seemed bigger, more generous. Houses were tidier, less books, no DVDs of course. It was a slow, predictable way of life. Everything and everyone in its place. Teachers, shopkeepers, neighbours. Seldom did people move away, and I knew no one whose parents were divorced. Perhaps I'm mourning the steadiness of it all, the regularity of trolley buses, trains, milkmen, postmen, and the Sunday roast. I would find it probably a bit too confining now to go back to that era, too prescriptive, but I was a child then, and I basked in the security it brought. We lived in a 3-bedroom semi-detached house in Gordon Avenue, a stone's throw from Highams Park Lake and Epping Forest. Ancient forest grazing rights allowed allowed local farmers to let their cattle roam free, often in our front garden. And I'm sure you're all nodding at all these memories, because your memories are my memories, and vice versa. Cows were obstacles to be avoided on foot or by car, taken totally for granted until the BSE crisis tightened regulations in the 1990s. And I can remember as a small child, about 4 or 5, thinking, there's a cow, I need to walk around that cow to go where I'm going. And there was a little bit of fear and trepidation, but not much. You just got on with it, because, to be honest, you couldn't have gone anywhere without suddenly coming right up against a cow. And the smaller you were, the larger the cow looked. Well, ancient forest rights, or grazing rights, allowed local farmers to let their cattle roam free, often in our front garden. And cows were obstacles to be avoided on foot or by car, as I mentioned. I can remember also, and I'm sure you can, there used to be a little stampede of cows when they were first let out, and suddenly you would be in your house and whoosh, they'd all go along, and you just sit tight until they'd gone. Walking past the house where I moved to in 1953, it seemed, walking past now, the house seems a bit smaller and unrecognisable due to new windows, gates and extensions taking away most of the front garden. I blush to say that the Christmas tree we planted is still visible in the back garden, taller than the chimney stack. I blame this all on my father, but all the ivy has been pulled down. And there were fuchsias and dahlias in the front, and red and white roses cascading over the back fence, and purple irises and gladioli, all gone. From the back bedroom window, we could see neighbours' gardens neatly mowed, more ordered than ours, especially on bonfire night when we were impatient for our father to come home so we could light our fireworks. The 5th of November was a big event in every suburban back garden. We lit up the sky with standard fireworks, as the advert said. Catherine wheels, rockets launched from milk bottles, pyramids of golden rain, all kept in a cardboard box purchased from a local stationer or newsagent. The Roberts have started, came the indignant cry as our display was invariably last. So there we were in the back bedroom window, seeing everyone starting, and my father was late coming home from work. But all was saved. Gardens in the 1950s, as you all well know, were dominated by sheds, lawnmowers and striped deck chairs. No one had benches or barbecues, seldom paddling pools. We had a filled washing up bowl that was brought out in a heat wave, but we had open-air swimming pools then, Larkswood or the Kingfisher. So we were hardly deprived. Even now I cannot walk down Oak Hill without recalling distant sounds of splashing water and laughter through the trees. The house, as I recall, was traditionally furnished. There were some old antique tables and velvet curtains and parquet flooring, loose linen covers on the traditional three-piece suite. There was G-plan furniture that was purchased in the 1960s, which must have seemed very modern at the time. And the first television we had, which had been bought for the coronation, was upgraded at regular intervals. And thinking about those televisions, they were all black and white, but they got bigger and more sophisticated with the years. There was President Kennedy's assassination, the Beatles at the Royal Variety Performance, the epic Forsyte saga, Churchill's funeral, Men on the Moon. All, as I say, in black and white. but larger than life, not to mention Emergency Ward 10, Compact and Dixon of Dock Green. We played my mother's 78 records on a bulky gramophone. Bing Crosby, Swan Lake and The Glass Mountain. We had the Beatles' first long players and singles in paper covers and their Christmas message from the fan club, the original floppy disk. The house was awash with magazines, which I thought was quite normal. Vogue, Harper's, McCall's on subscription, and my mother had worked at Vogue magazine up in London, so she passed on her love of fashion to 3 very enthusiastic daughters. And we used to dress up in hats from the 1940s and 50s that she kept at the top of an old utility wardrobe. And she had a huge black cartwheel made from shiny straw, a pink felt cloche, a grey linen bow with streamers she always wore to funerals, a collection of swim hats that were extravagantly covered in rubber and frills. This all seemed quite normal to me. I don't think it was really, but I enjoyed it. And the clothes that came into the house over the years were stunning. There was far more dressing up on a daily basis by my sisters and I. Sometimes I see trends coming back, knee-high boots, mini-skirts, PVC mats, but that was another life and a different era. And I no longer remember the names of the models, but I can still see their false eyelashes and corkscrew curls and pale painted faces. So much of a house is retained in memory, one doesn't need photographs. The cluttered cutlery drawer lined in grey velvet, a melamine cocktail cabinet fitted discreetly into the sideboard. My father having refused my request for plastic pineapple. I also wanted a lava lamp. You wouldn't let me have one of those either. There was knitting and smoking, Monopoly and the Moonstone on the BBC on Sunday afternoons. A sense of order prevailed, even if tablecloths covered piles of paper buried underneath. Bread and butter on Crown Derby plates by lamplight in the dining room on Sunday evenings. Meals were predictable, lamb or pork chops, always roast beef on Sundays, delivered by bicycle on Saturday morning, the joint bound with string and flat metal skewers wrapped in kitchen paper. Milk was delivered from Hitchman's Dairies, never bought. I still love the sound of an early morning milk float, the chink of empty bottles being collected from the step. Coal came from Charrington's. We were instructed, as I'm sure you all were too, to count the bags as it was deposited in the coal shed. Vegetables, for some of the time, were sold from a van, although we did go to the greengrocers by the library. Starched laundry was delivered in stiff brown paper. There were more sheets, pillowcases and tea towels all bundled up on the stairs ready for collection. And the details were written on a buff card and tied with string. So all this went out to the laundry van and it all came back in brown paper the next week. No washing machine or a tumble dryer. That was years and years later. Washing was done by hand in the kitchen sink, but my mother did have a spin dryer, and that was like a whirling dervish. And it seemed to have a life of its own. It started here and ended up halfway across the kitchen floor. And it smelt of surf and hot rubber, but it seemed to go on for years, you know. And we only had the one fridge as well. You know, I don't remember us ever changing those bits of electrical equipment. And I've managed to find a couple of old books with the collectible cards of tropical birds gummed carefully into albums. And probably one or two of these might have been mine. This was probably mine because it's not finished and it's a bit of a mess. But this was probably my husband's because it's all neat and tidy and beautifully finished, which says everything really. I think mine were sort of half finished and then the cards were piled up somewhere. Now, nothing instant, no gravy granules, no tea bags, no scanning, no change of label, everything very predictable. My mother learned to drive in 1960, which I would have said was ahead of her time, really. And she was fortunate, for those of you that don't remember Highams Park in those days, because she would park on bomb sites. One was at the back of the library, up the top by the greengrocers, there's a little track going up, or in Handsworth Avenue where the health centre now stands. So those were bits of waste ground and that's where she would park. But really a lot of shopping was done on foot, setting off through the alley past the allotments on Saturday afternoons. Now all the local shops we frequented, I still remember them intimately. There was Frank's, the tailors, with tack suits on display in the window, if you remember. And that suit seemed to be there for years. It wasn't really a long time, but to a child, it seemed forever. There was Meadows, with overflowing crates of toys, farm animals, kaleidoscopes. There was so much packed into Meadows. There was Mrs. Farraway's sweet shop with a display of, she had a cabinet of Fuller's cakes, angel cake, chocolate sponge, and our favourite, which was coloured in orange fondant icing, decorated with little sugar segments. My mother bought scarlet lipsticks and powder puffs and Signal toothpaste at the Co-op chemist. Each purchase was accompanied by our dividend number, which I can still remember now. I expect you all know yours. 607859. How do you recall these things? I couldn't say, but my sisters would know exactly like I do. And there was a little bit of local glamour because I believe, and you might know more about this than me, but there was an assistant in the Co-op chemists in the 60s, and she was the female drummer in a pop group called the Honeycombs. So there we are. There was Chalkley's, the bakers, and that had marble shelves stacked with Chivers jellies and miniature Hovis loaves, if you remember. It always smelled of freshly baked bread, still warm, wrapped in tissue paper. And there were Eccles cakes, meringues, madeleines, cheesecakes, bearing no resemblance to the American variety. You know, a Chalkley's cheesecake, I can see it now, it was like a little bit of sort of puff pastry and white icing, and then a sort of coconut shredded mixture on the top. But why it was called cheesecake, I have no idea, but that's what you asked for, and you couldn't mess about. If you were in the queue, you had to say what you wanted. That queue went out right down the street, and you had to know exactly what you wanted. And round the corner was a Swiss patisserie. Karina knows the name of this. Ingis, yes. How I forgot that, I don't know. And they had strawberry tarts piped with fresh cream and chocolate gâteaux boxed up in cardboard and tied with thin gold ribbon. There was French's, the butcher's shop, if you all remember. And for me as a child, it smelled of fresh meat and sawdust covering the black and white tiles. Strings of sausages and joints of meat hung from huge hooks in the window, and the wooden butcher's blocks were sloping and scrubbed with daily use. The garden shop, smelling of cut flowers and turf, spilled over with brightly coloured seed packets and terracotta flower pots. Shops were busy, thriving places, with laddish greengrocers and genteel confectioners. There was no competition from supermarkets. Shopping was done on a daily basis. Our first fridge was purchased from the electricity showrooms, and personally I didn't have a freezer. My parents never had a freezer, and it was only when I was married in 1974 that perhaps that was when they were all the rage. One of my favourite shops was Arnott's, the stationer's, with its glass display cabinet of Parker fountain pens. But the shop I remember best, and I hope you'll agree with me here, was Gill Brothers, an old-fashioned draper's just along from the cinema. In summer, the windows were protected from sunlight by yellow cellophane, like Lucasade bottles in the old days. Inside, there were wooden cupboards and labelled drawers behind the counters, an old-fashioned till, bentwood chairs, wooden floors. There were bolts of fabric, gingham, flower-sprigged cotton, winceyette for home dressmaking. Paper patterns and reels of coloured cotton swung round on stands on the counters. Buttons were bought on strips of card or counted out individually. It was also time-consuming, but so interesting to a young child who had nothing better to do than stand and stare. I think I find it really frustrating now going in and queuing up for all these things, but as a child it was wonderful. Items would be wrapped in a torn-off strip of brown paper like a Christmas cracker. I don't know whether you remember that. It was a wonderful roll of brown, shiny paper. And Gill Brothers evokes memories of shop bells, gentlemen in white shirt sleeves, black waistcoats and pocket watches. The name haberdashery conjured up a box of delights in that emporium: needles, name tapes, elastic, bias binding of all widths and colours. And then there were the opticians, such as Henry Morgan's, with their rows of multicoloured bird-like spectacle frames, and knitting shops with catalogues of well-thumbed patterns, girls, teenage, or babies' matinee coats. Soft balls of wool of all colours were pressed into shelves against the wall, as inviting as a box of fondants in the sweet shop. There were squares of felt and embroidery silks in luscious colours, looped into black paper bands with gold writing. Pruim's shoe shop windows were crammed with footwear and a generous display of the latest Pirelli slippers. There were plimsolls and ballet shoes of softest leather, pink, black or scarlet, that reminded me of the film The Red Shoes. Inside, the walls were stacked perilously high with shoe boxes, each balancing on another. And I used to be in fear and trembling of all these boxes coming down and everyone being hurt by them. But they never seemed to happen. But Mr. Pruim had this wonderful way of, suddenly it was like Jenga, taking a box of shoes out from this huge pile. And somehow nobody seemed to leave the shop without a shoebox fitting snugly inside a brown paper bag. And those bags sort of fitted the shoebox within an inch of their lives, and you had to cut it off when you got home. And there was something for everyone. And Mr. Pruim was strict Jew, so he closed on the Sabbath and opened on Sunday mornings, which was really quite unusual in those days. In every small parade, like the shops in Highams Park and other little towns, there were dress shops, and ours was called Mimi Temple, and there were dressed mannequins and hats on display. And I remember in 1960 we went to Spain, and that was very cutting edge, and my mother bought a duster coat from Mimi Temple. It was pale apple green, sort of, it's a nice sort of elegant cotton coat with 3/4 length sleeves, and she had this tricell dark green dress which toned in with the pale green coat, and this was her travelling outfit. Of course, people shopped farther afield. In those days, Bearman's at Leytonstone drew in the crowds, and London stores such as Dickens and Jones and Marsh and Snellgrove were only a train ride away. Yet there was no doubt that people shopped locally for a great variety of goods, because Bearman's was miles away and no one had thought of shopping malls. In its way, Highams Park was quite self-sufficient. There was very little self-service and far more interaction between customer and shop assistant. Glass baubles, so fragile they needed constantly replacing for the Christmas tree, were chosen and wrapped individually in the post office each Christmas. Very little, as I remember, was bought in bulk. Bits and pieces were bought as you required them. And even biscuits could be selected individually from tea chests and scooped into brown paper bags. The home and colonial stores was the nearest we came to a supermarket on our side of the line, until Budgeon opened its doors in the 1970s. And its leisurely music and ambience was a far cry from Tesco's in Walthamstow High Street, who piled everything high and sold it cheap. Well, banks had managers, grocers had assistants, distinctly dressed in overalls and turbans in the home and colonial stores, and Pamphilons had a grey-haired assistant, a gentleman who specialised in oil and paraffin, and you always went to see him if this is what you required, and it seemed like most people did need oil or paraffin in those days. And it seemed a messy job, and as a child I remember looking and thinking his skin seemed stained like these brown overalls he would wear. And the shop was dark to my memory. I don't know whether you all remember Pamphilons, but you would keep going towards the back and it seemed to get darker and darker. And it was like Aladdin's cave, of potato peelers and icing bags and saucepans and crockery heaped on a table on a raised wooden floor. We were sent in frequently, my sisters and I, to replenish our stock of everyday cups and saucers. We never had mugs in those days. We always had these plain green or flower patterned or gaily checked cups and saucers, but there was a range that was sort of bright blue and white broad stripes, and my mother wouldn't let us buy those. But we saw what else there was on offer. On Mother's Day, for Mother's Day or for my mother's birthday, we were always sent down to buy presents in Pamphilons, trays and jam jars resembling bunches of grapes. It was where we bought rubber plugs and teapot lids, had knives sharpened. There was this trend of waste not, want not in the post-war years. Shoes were repaired next to the post office, fitted with metal segs to stop the soles wearing down too fast. Radios and vacuum cleaners were serviced, repaired at a shop by the railway line called Wirewell. And for years I thought Wirewell was the shopkeeper's name. And I thought, well, how fortunate he was to have an electrical shop with a name like that. There were several sweet shops, and one of my favourites was the Cosy Corner that you see here. And this was right along by the end of the avenue shops opposite the library. And a dark wooden tray. My friends and I would go in after school and would say, I think Rosemary Marks put us onto this, we'd go in and we'd say, please can we see the tray? And produced from below the counter was a big brown wooden tray, really old-fashioned, and it was like one of those memory games where you remember everything and then somebody covers up everything and you have to say what's on the tray. Well, he had little Parma violets and shrimps and seafood and blackjacks and sherbet flying saucers, and everything was a penny, and we would pick and choose what we wanted. And aniseed twist and sherbet lemons were shaken onto scales from huge glass jars. Pieces of fudge and fondants were carefully plucked from cardboard boxes lined in tissue paper. This was a book my sister would have been given, I think, at the time of the coronation, and some of you are familiar with that. We used to go to a field study site, and there's a photograph of us in Selwyn Playground. That's me, and that's Rosemary, and a couple of other friends. And we used to go fortnightly, and that was a very sort of innovative thing. And we used to have to write up our notes afterwards, and I've still got the notebooks at home, all about the things we did in Epping Forest. And that was all organised by the Borough of Walthamstow in those days. We weren't Waltham Forest then, and this was the information about the Walthamstow Field Study Centres. And I think Creena went to Mr. Speedman at High Beach, and I went to Mr. Hoy at the Jubilee Retreat in Chingford. And here's some photographs of Selwyn School, which hasn't changed very much. And I went back there a few years ago, and although it's brightly decorated and painted, you can still see some old cupboards and sinks and desks, and that's what I was looking for, and the old radiators and the high windows. So it hasn't really changed very much. And there it is, the playground, and there's a photograph I took with a camera, a little box camera I was given, of all the classmates hanging out the classroom window on the last day of term. And I'm sure you've seen these pictures before. This I copied up on my computer from an old postcard of Highams Park on the other side of the line, towards Selwyn. And then this one I have got somewhere, but I found this on the internet, so it's come up a bit hazy and fuzzy. But that's the parade of shops, and there's Panthelons. And then here's the little parade of shops going down from the Regal Cinema all the way up to Oak Hill. And some nice old photographs as well here. So I'm sure so many of you have many, many more memories of things that I've forgotten to say. But I wondered, I'd like to ask you, how many of you have lived in Highams Park a long while? Yes. So how many of you remember the 1950s and the 60s and the 70s? And is there anyone who's recently moved to Highams Park? Yes. So we're all sharing all these happy memories of how it was. And I shall let it rest.
That's wonderful. Thank you. I'm just going to finish by saying, Penny, I can't really add anything to Penny's talk. I think we've had talks from 2005 onwards, and this has been one of the most beautiful, poetic and evocative talks we've ever had about Highams Park. I'm sure you'll agree. I've got this down, I was can't read it now. In terms of the way you spoke, Penny, I hope you don't take this as an insult, but I think we have here Highams Park's John Betjeman. And you really do have a way with words. I just think you'll recall past events, and also I think your way of explaining Highams Park from your childhood is very, very interesting. Because for those of us, either those of us who have lived here continually since our childhoods, or people who have moved away, Highams Park is always a place of childhood, isn't it, really? And Penny's explanation and talk about her childhood, I'm sure stirred many memories. I think the best thing will be to ask people, can we ask me to talk to you afterwards?
Yes, absolutely.
Yes. We'll serve wine afterwards.
Share everything with each other.
Yeah.
Yes.
Has anyone got anything they'd like to add to Penny's talk before we break for wine private conversations?
There's just one thing I forgot to mention, if I can. I brought this photograph along of the lake, and I love this one, people skating on Highams Park Lake in Edwardian times. And my husband and I moved to our old house in Derby Road, which was left in a bit of a time warp, 25 years ago. And our younger daughter was about 10, and I decided to write her some stories about my imagination of children who lived in that house in Victorian times. And these children came back to play in the garden with my daughter and her friend. And I decided in the little winter section of the story that they would go to the church, St Mary's Church, down the road, and it would be in the old-fashioned style of things before the fire. And then they would see these two children that had grown up in this house, and then they'd go back into the present again. And then that evening, I think a couple of nights after Christmas in the story, these two children in my imagination who lived in the house would go running down Oak Hill with their parents and skate on the lake. And that was just me fusing up the photograph of the lake in Edwardian times and imagining going down that way from this house. Thank you.
I'm also going to say, Penny has published how many books you've got?
Oh, a lot, but only in a very little gentle way. Nothing. I have got a website. You'll see everything on my website.
I did ask you for some books tonight.
And I haven't.
I'm sure Andrew will still.
But the idea really now, what I'd like to do with this website is, when I really retire and have more time, is to put things on it and to share things, and I do a couple of little blogs as well about books I've enjoyed reading and places I've enjoyed travelling to. But to be honest, at the moment life's getting in the way, and I'm trying to help my grandson with his GCSEs. And I'm still working part-time. But what I would say, and I really feel strongly about this, and this is a quote from Laurie Lee, a favourite writer I know you're familiar with. There is nothing that preserves things so much as writing, and nothing obliterates the memory so much as not taking the trouble to make a record of it at the time. You do it in order to arrest time and fix it in the mind, to perhaps cheat mortality to a point. I think that's as much as my writing aims to do, nothing more. A day unremembered is like a soul unborn, worse than if it had never been. What indeed was that summer if it is not recalled, that journey, that act of love? Any bits of warm life preserved by the pen are trophies snatched from the dark. And I do implore you now to enjoy writing up all your memories while you've still got them. And I sat with a lady from St Mary's Church today for a couple of hours, and I'm writing a piece about her memoirs for the church magazine. And she couldn't remember where her house keys were. She couldn't remember where her bus pass was, her spectacles, and yet we found them all. That wasn't a problem. But what she could remember was her childhood. And it's terribly important, I think, that these memories continue in our lives and for the lives of everyone who comes in.
I'm going to say thank you very much, Penny Freestone, and welcome back. And I hope you've enjoyed your night at Highams Park. And thank you very much from everybody here. Thank you, Penny.